Perhaps no game has suffered more from a negative perception than E.T. the Extraterrestrial for the Atari 2600. It has been called the worst game ever made, and has even been blamed as the cause of the great video game crash of the mid-80s. But is this justified? Today I'm going to take a look at this much maligned game, seeing if it truly did cause the crash, if it really is that bad, and even look to see if some of its qualities should perhaps be celebrated today. Howard Scott Warshaw, the lead programmer of the game, takes great pride in the fact that he created what is considered one of the best games for the Atari 2600 in Yar's Revenge, and what is considered one of the worst games on the system in E.T. That shows quite the range for a programmer, but while he enjoys the attention and will joke about the game's reputation, even he doesn't believe it's one of the worst games ever made. When someone makes that claim, he wonders if they even read the manual. So before we start dissecting everything, allow me to give a brief overview on how to play E.T. for the 2600. In the game, you play as E.T. trying to recover 3 pieces of his interplanetary phone in order to call his ship to rescue him. The world takes place on a 6-sided cube. The 4 middle sides contain many pitfalls or wells. It is in 3 of these wells where you will find the pieces of your phone. In the wells, you can press the button to levitate, to both soften your fall and to escape. You can also collect dots on the pitfall screens that represent pieces of candy. When you leave a pitfall screen to the left or to the right, you will always go to another pitfall screen. When you leave a pitfall screen at the top, you will always go to the landing site, where the ship will rescue you if successful. When you leave any pitfall screen at the bottom, you will always go to the screen with the 3 buildings, which hold the FBI agent, the scientist, and Elliot. You cannot interact with these buildings. When you leave the landing site or the building screen from any of the 4 sides, you will always go to one of the 4 pitfall screens depending on which side you leave. When you move around the various screens, you will see various icons show up in the middle top. According to the manual, these are called power zones. By pressing the button, you can activate the power that is shown. The donut-looking shape allows you to eat a piece of candy to gain some more energy. The calling face calls Elliot, who will come to you and take your candy, either for bonus points, or if you have 9 pieces of candy, he will take it, leave, find a missing piece of the phone, and bring it back to you. The question mark can make a flash occur in one of the wells, which means a telephone piece is in it. The column sends the enemies away. The FBI agent will steal a piece of your phone if he touches you, and the scientist just takes you to the building screen. The arrows will transport you one screen in the direction which they are pointing. The Space Invader thing calls your ship once you have all 3 pieces of your phone with no enemy on the screen. Do so and the timer will count down. You must find the landing zone on the landing site when the timer runs out to be rescued, but if an enemy is on the screen, and in some variations if Elliot's on the screen, the ship will not show up. Get rescued and you can continue building your score by repeating the process. Lose all of your energy, which is constantly going down, and you lose a life. Although Elliot will revive you with a little more energy, but he will only do this 3 times. 4 if you find and revive the flower in one of the wells. For all the hate that E.T. gets, there are some special things about the game that are worthy of praise and often get overlooked. Both the graphics, which were done by Jerome Demurat, and the sounds are really well done by 2600 standards. You have some large, recognizable characters along with some nice sound effects. I especially like the sound of the ship landing. The game may also have one of the best title screens for any 2600 game. Most Atari 2600 games didn't even have a title screen, but here we have a nice looking E.T. accompanied by a nice mini version of the John Williams E.T. theme. The power zone mechanic is actually kind of genius, giving you multiple actions to do on a single button joystick. The game also has some great Easter eggs that, if pulled off, will allow you to see Yar from Yar's Revenge, Indiana Jones from the 2600 version of Raiders of the Lost Ark, another Howard Scott Warshaw game, and even the initials of both Howard Scott Warshaw and Jerome Demurat. I'll put a link in the description below to a video that shows you how to activate these Easter eggs if you're interested. But alas, the game does have flaws. The main flaw often brought up is the collision detection. E.T. is large, and if any small part of him touches the pit, even the tip top of his head, he will fall in. This makes it near impossible to go in between certain screens without falling. And getting up and out of a well can be frustrating too. This could have been partially fixed by only making his feet or even just the lower half of his body susceptible to the collision detection. I believe some hacks have been made to try to fix this. But I believe the game has another problem that is often overlooked. The default variation is the hardest variation of the game. While most 2600 games have multiple game variations, the default variation is usually one of the easiest. And most 2600 games are easy to pick up and play. But here, reading the manual is almost a must, and the default variation is the hardest, with both the FBI agent and the scientist trying to get in your way. The second variation removes the scientist, and the third and final variation removes them both. So if someone were to try to play this game blind on the default variation, that could easily lead to a frustrating experience. I think simply changing the default variation to the easiest variation, where the player can explore at a more leisurely pace while learning the game, could have led to a more positive experience with the game overall for more players. All in all, while it may not be the best game on the system, it certainly isn't one of the worst, especially if you take the time to learn it. If you want to try some truly awful Atari 2600 games, I recommend you try something like Karate, Dish Aster, or even Atari's own Sword Quest Fireworld. I believe there are aspects of ET that should be celebrated, like the sounds and the graphics, the title screen, and even the setup of the world with all the power zones, especially when you look past the collision detection problem. Howard Scott Warshaw should actually be commended for what he pulled off considering the limited time he was given to make this game. More on that later. When ET is cited as the cause of the great video game crash of the 80s, imagery has been painted of a multitude of customers returning the game to stores after the Christmas of 1982, causing stores to send them back to Atari, which had no choice but to bury this poison pill of a game in the landfill. But this idea blends truth with fiction that doesn't paint the real picture. So let's look at the origins of the game and what really happened when it hit store shelves. E.T. was a monster hit movie in the summer of '82. Steve Ross, CEO of Warner Brothers, the parent company of Atari at the time, paid Steven Spielberg over $20 million for the rights to make a video game based on it. That in of itself is insane, but some believe this obscene amount wasn't just for the game, but to also try to pry Spielberg away from Universal to make movies for Warner. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but Spielberg did work on Twilight Zone the movie and The Color Purple, which were both distributed by Warner Brothers not too long after the E.T. Atari deal. With the deal in place, the pressure was on to get the game made in time for Christmas of that year. Howard accepted the challenge to finish the game in a little over 5 weeks, with only 2 days to formulate the gameplay idea and present it to Spielberg himself. Normally, a game would be rushed to be finished in 5 months, much less 5 weeks, but the manufacturing time didn't allow for much more than a month in this case. If the game was going to be ready by Christmas of '82, this is what had to be done. Something that is often overlooked about E.T. is that it was a big seller when it was released. Billboard ranked it as the number 3 best-selling video game during the Christmas season of '82, with Pitfall being number 1, a game that is considered one of the best for the 2600. And E.T. kept selling after '82. It even sold over 99,000 extra copies from 1986 to 1990, when the NES was king and the 2600 was repackaged as a budget system. According to some reports, E.T. is actually one of the top 10 best-selling games of all time for the Atari 2600. Being in the top 10 is especially impressive when you take into account that over 400 games came out for the system in North America alone. But there was a problem. Atari expected even more copies of E.T. to be sold. So even though it was a bestseller, hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million of unsold cartridges sat in warehouses. And this wasn't the only game Atari had too much stock of. When the infamous dig happened in Alamogordo, New Mexico, copies of E.T. were discovered, but they only represented maybe 1/10 of what was found. Also found were copies of well-regarded games, like Asteroids, Centipede, and Defender, as well as some hardware. Atari didn't have an ET problem, they had an overstock of everything problem. At one point, Atari was the fastest growing company in the history of the world, but something happened in '82, the same year ET was released, that would catch Atari off guard and eventually lead to the crash of the gaming industry. When the Atari 2600 came out in 1977 under the name Atari Video Computer System, it was accompanied by 9 different game titles. In 1978, 11 more titles were released, followed by another 11 more in 1979. 1980 saw the release of 13 more titles, including a monster hit in Space Invaders for Atari. And 5 of those titles came from the first third-party developer for the system, Activision. 1981 saw another 16 titles come out, along with another third-party developer, Apollo. Up to this point, with such limited competition on store shelves, almost any game released for the 2600 could be a moneymaker. And this is why Atari felt confident in continuing to manufacture a large amount of software and strong-arm retailers when it came to distribution. But the smell of money and the success of Activision attracted multiple companies to throw their hat into the ring. In 1982, the number of third-party developers jumped from 2 the year prior to 19, a 950% increase. And the number of overall game titles released jumped to 107, which is almost a 700% increase from 81, and dwarfed the total number of games released from all the previous years combined. As a matter of fact, more games were released in October of 1982 for the Atari 2600 than the entirety of 1981. At the same time, new systems like the Vectrex, ColecoVision, and even Atari's own Atari 5200 were entering the fray, joining the likes of the Odyssey 2 and Intellivision, adding to a gaming tsunami. While researching for this video, I could find no hard evidence of customers returning ET cartridges in droves. But what I did find was retailers struggling with trying to return their overstock of 2600 games, which did include ET, but not just ET. Some games still sold well, including ET, but in 1 year, the massive amount of new game titles, third-party developers, and even new systems caused the supply and demand formula for Atari to drastically flip. Retailers simply had too many games on the shelves, and they would often cut the prices, as well as decrease future orders from distributors. And to make matters worse, the flood kept coming. In 1983, the number of third-party developers jumped from 19 to 36, almost doubling. And the amount of 2600 game titles released jumped from 107 to now 173 in a single year. If you thought the flood of 82 was bad, the amount of games released in 83 was bigger than all the previous years combined, including 82. The market simply couldn't handle the massive flood of new game titles for the 2600, especially when you add all the other systems and their games. Atari was unprepared for such a change, with their overflowing warehouses full of unsold games and hardware serving as proof. Stores continued to slash prices to deal with the overflow. People may think it was only the bad games that hit the clearance bins, but the problem was so big even good games were not immune. When Atari is burying games like Centipede and Asteroids in landfills, not just ET, you know you have a problem. Only one single game released in 1983 for the 2600 was able to make the all-time bestseller list in Ms. Pac-Man, which came out in early 83. No games released after would sniff the top 20 bestseller list. Atari, which was structured for big growth, collapsed, with the home division being sold to Jack Tramiel of Commodore 64 fame in 1984. Almost every third-party developer either closed shop or returned to other non-video game related business. Support for all home systems basically died. 1984 would see a much more modest 37 titles come out for the 2600 released by 13 companies. In 1985, only 3 Atari 2600 titles were released, one by Parker Brothers, who was supported by Board Games, and 2 by Activision, whose tighter budget and work on computer software made them one of the few survivors. ET for the Atari 2600 has unfairly been treated as a scapegoat for decades, and often called one of the worst games ever, sometimes by people who never even played the game or took the time to learn how it works. During the Christmas of 1982, I myself went to a neighbor's house where the kids got River Raid and ET for their 2600, and guess what? They liked both games. As a matter of fact, when I got my 7800 in the late 80s, I bought my copy of ET from the discounted section of my local Toys R Us, where I would occasionally get other older games like Missile Command or Asteroids. I had no idea it was supposed to be such a terrible game until I heard it online in the early 2000s. Yes, I've heard secondhand stories of people who got the game and hated it immediately, but I've also heard of those who grew up with it and actually kind of like it. Yes, it has its flaws, but ET also has its overlooked good qualities. And Howard Scott Warshaw should get some praise for what he was able to pull off in such a short amount of time. And I simply see no evidence that ET caused the industry crash. Some of the highest regarded games on the system like Pitfall, River Raid, and Ms. Pac-Man all came out during a similar time period, titles that could have easily taken care of any bad taste a lesser game may have caused. All the evidence to me points to an industry that simply produced way too much product without a way to mitigate such a scenario and collapsed on itself, while a candy-loving alien unfairly took the blame. But that's just what I think. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you next time.